Welcome to this installment of supplemental lectures provided by PNC's Concurrent Enrollment Program. My name is Alexandra Kindle, and I will share some information with you that comes out of my history courses at Purdue University North Central. Today we will do a quick review of the 1970s with a focus on the presidency of Richard Nixon. There is a lot to study in this period, but for today we will focus on fleshing out a few themes to understand why the 1970s were such a problematic time for the nation. Much of the 1970s was a reaction to the events of the mid to late 1960s, and this was true with events surrounding the Vietnam War. While Americans probably are most familiar with Vietnam in the late 1960s, American participation went further back in time. President Kennedy had inherited the Vietnam War from Eisenhower and continued American activities there because Kennedy thought the Cold War was a war worth winning. JFK sent troops to run operations there and started the defoliation program. Here you can see the same river before and after defoliation. American troops found it difficult to fight through the jungle, so it made sense to eliminate that obstacle. Kennedy also authorized the use of napalm, or jellied gasoline. As used in the war, it provided Americans with some poignant images. The young girl pictured on the right had survived a napalm attack, and that image represented one part of this war to people who witnessed it from their armchairs. On the left, you can see the same girl as an adult talking about her experiences and showing her burns. Then, of course, Johnson used reported attacks on American ships to extract aid from Congress under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. By 1967, there were 500,000 troops in Vietnam. He also instituted Rolling Thunder, which was the first sustained bombing of North Vietnam. By the late 60s, the tonnage of bombs that had been dropped on Vietnam exceeded that of bombs dropped on all theaters of World War II. The United States went from assisting the North Vietnamese to fighting the war. Thus, for most of the 1960s, the war in Vietnam had been escalating, but a few protested prior to 1965. By 1967, more than 4,000 American soldiers had died in the war, and students were rallying in large masses of protesters in major cities, places such as Washington, D.C. and New York City, for example. This was becoming a crisis for the nation. Even politicians started protesting the war, and Johnson was trying to fight the other war, the war on poverty, at the same time. Johnson was losing the war in Southeast Asia and at home. The war also destroyed Johnson's presidency and his domestic program. As the 1968 election neared, Johnson decided he would not run again. 1968 was a violent year. Students were in full protest mode, there were race riots in almost every major city in the nation, and both Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. It was also an election year. President Johnson shocked the nation when he announced in March 1968, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." Without Johnson, Herbert Humphrey ran under the Democratic banner, while Americans also had the choice of two conservatives, Richard Nixon, who was an experienced politician and a Cold War hawk, and also George Wallace, who was the more conservative of the two and a publicly declared segregationist. Nixon ran as a Republican, while Wallace took up the American Independent Party. In the wake of the New Frontier and the Great Society, race riots and noisy students frustrated middle Americans, people who worked hard to maintain a home and family. The complaints of these people were far removed from the lives of suburbanites who had mortgages, college funds, and taxes on their mind. This so-called silent center, or silent majority, protested as well, but not by marching or rioting. They won their fight to end what they saw as an assault on their values in the election of 1968. After the Progressive Era and the New Deal, Americans demanded and gained more conservative governments, and after the Kennedy-Johnson years, American voters did the same. They were able to do this in the polls because the majority of Americans at the time were conservative compared to the radicals headlining the news. After years of division over race and war, Nixon promised to bring Americans back together again. He spoke to their concerns about social unrest, federal expenditures, and getting out of the war honorably. While he may not have gotten a large percentage of the vote, you can see that the two conservatives combined dominated the election. Voters came out to see a change in the policies of the national government. Now President Nixon, well knew that the U.S. had to get out of Vietnam, but he needed to maintain American honor. The majority of Americans did not want to admit defeat. He dealt with the problems with Vietnam in two ways. First, he wanted to quell the protests, and since most of the opposition came from young people, he scaled down the draft. At first, this led to a lottery system, and then by the time Nixon left office, it had become an all-volunteer system. Many of the protesters had been college students who did not want to go to war and had little voice in it depending on their state. In many states, young people could not vote until they reached 21 years of age, yet they could be drafted at 18 years. Nixon was able to scale back the draft because of his second approach to ending the war, known as Vietnamization. This was Nixon's way of getting the U.S. out by building up the South Vietnamese troops. The South Vietnamese had to start running the war and doing their own training. At the same time, Nixon started withdrawing American troops. By 1969, American troop strength was reduced to 60,000. Despite that, the war was not over. Nixon and his closest advisor, Henry Kissinger, believed that the North Vietnamese were launching attacks from Cambodia and Laos, and he authorized secret bombings of these territories. Then on April 30, 1970, Nixon announced to Americans that the United States had started an invasion of Cambodia. Literally overnight, the Cambodian invasion restored the dwindling anti-war movement to vigorous life. Demonstrators appeared on college campuses across the nation during the first days of May, such as these you see on the Kent State campus. You can also see that the National Guard was waiting for them. Then on May 4th, the National Guard killed 4 protesters at Kent State University, and 10 days later, police killed 2 more students at Jackson State University in Mississippi. In the wake of this, Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, stripping the president of what had long served as the legal basis for the war. News of atrocities were leaked to the press, and Americans no longer supported the war and wanted withdrawal from Vietnam. Vietnamization failed to prepare the South Vietnamese troops to handle their affairs, and the North Vietnamese continued to mount offensives, demonstrating the strength of their support in that nation. In 1972, the United States and the North Vietnamese finally met in Paris to negotiate the end of U.S. involvement. The agreement included a ceasefire, return of American POWs, and the removal of U.S. troops. The last troops were withdrawn on March 29, 1973. The United States did not negotiate the peace between the North and the South, and the North Vietnamese overran the South. Ho Chi Minh's men captured the capital of the South, and officials renamed it Saigon. 3, 2, 1. Ho Chi Minh's men captured the capital of the South, and officials renamed Saigon. It was now Ho Chi Minh City. By 1975, Americans were forced out. The United States assisted the South Vietnamese for 25 years to contain communism, but lost the fight. Unfortunately, the Vietnamese people now had to find a way to live after 25 years of a civil war. Interesting to note, President Eisenhower in the 1950s stood behind containment in the fight against communism because of the domino theory. But when South Vietnam finally fell, the other dominoes of Southeast Asia did not fall with it. This would be a great topic for discussion in class. While these events were going on, there was also a growing movement for greater awareness and action on behalf of the environment. Nixon, as president, oversaw some of the most dramatic legislation for the environment. Since 1962, when Rachel Carson published her findings about toxic chemicals affecting the bird population, Americans began to become more concerned about the environment in terms of polluting the air, water, and soil. On college campuses around the nation, some students were protesting civil rights abuses or the war. Others were advocating for students' rights in the free speech movement in the late 60s. Some students were becoming politicized and learning about the environment in various projects, including symposiums and teach-ins. Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson wanted to activate that sentiment and energy to create something bigger and get the environmental cause put on the national agenda. By 1970, these folks combined and coalesced for the first Earth Day on April 22nd. These people utilized techniques from the civil rights movement, including massive congregations similar to those going on in 1963, when Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. 20 million Americans participated in the events around the nation on April 22nd, that first Earth Day. There were critics of the new movement from right and from the left. Conservatives viewed this as another illiberal attempt to bring the U.S. into the clutches of the Soviets, or at least argued against the movement, citing such reasons. Some liberals viewed this as a distraction from protesting the Vietnam War or the real problems of people, including workers and people of color. There was a lot of protest about in the late 1960s and early 70s. Despite the fact that President Nixon was not an environmentalist and was a conservative politician, he saw the political currency of the movement and signed some of the most important legislation relating to the environment. J. Brooks Flippin chronicled Nixon's actions in his 2000 book, Nixon and the Environment. He argues that Nixon did more for the environment than any other president. There's an important point here. In a day when Nixon is remembered for his paranoid and unstable nature, it is easy to forget the work he did while president. I cannot give witness to all the good and bad of his presidency in this lecture, but it is good to remember that it was not all bad. Another area where Nixon showed political savvy came with the Cold War more generally. Like the presidents of the post-war era, he was not soft on communism. Nixon's foreign policy was a bit different than his predecessors, however. He was certainly anti-communist and had the credentials to prove it, serving on the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1940. Throughout the 1950s, he also railed against the Democrats for losing China to the communists. But he adopted, by the time he became president, a more interactive response to communism than containment, which had become the standard since President Truman. Nixon pursued a policy of détente with the Soviet Union and a new openness with China. The term détente in French means relaxation, but you can also think of this as a thawing out of the Cold War. In a series of meetings between 1970 and 1972, Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev resolved tensions over Cuba and Berlin. Remember that Cuban Missile Crisis? It was still a little tense. They also signed the SALT I Treaty, which stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This is considered a first symbolic step to ending the Cold War arms race. Nixon, under the influence of his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, believed that he could break the impasse that kept the countries out of productive dialogue. Then, in 1972, Nixon visited China, being the first sitting U.S. president to visit the communist nation. His week-long trip was televised, and the president pledged better relations with China. What was brilliant about this strategy is that instead of making the Cold War a two-way war of ideological hate, he made it a three-way relationship. He could play one against the other, taking the pressure off one-to-one tensions of Russia versus the United States. Again, he could do this because he had bona fides in the world of anti-communism. He said to Mao Zedong, "Those on the right can do what those on the left only talk about." Overall, Nixon pursued a foreign policy based on realism, which meant his policies focused on achieving goals based on the U.S. national interest. This seems a bit vague, right? You can compare this with, say, the type of moral diplomacy of Woodrow Wilson. Pursuing realism did not mean trying to implement democracy for the good of the other nation or toppling regimes for humanitarian reasons. It meant pursuing a more selfish style of foreign policy. Another way to think about it is that realists think in terms of power, not so much as ideology. Nixon did the best he could to end a bad situation, but at the same time he was creating a problem for himself that changed the nation and its relationship to politics. He promised Americans if elected he would bring truth and openness back to the presidency. Johnson had not always been truthful to Congress and the public about the actions he authorized in Vietnam. Nixon promised a return to a trustworthy government that would represent the silent, forgotten majority of middle-class Americans. He promoted their middle-class values of patriotism and the fear of crime. But what Watergate showed was that he was willing to break the law and abuse his power as president to maintain his position. Nixon's downfall began with the 1972 break-in of an office in the Watergate apartment complex, seen here. 5 men connected to the committee to re-elect the president were arrested for going through files and installing electronic devices in this office, which just happened to be the headquarters of the Democratic Party. Investigations revealed that the president was probably involved in the cover-up, which included hush money, destruction of FBI records, and wiretapping. Nixon tended to be paranoid and taped many of his conversations in his office. Prosecutors demanded he turn over these tapes, and he refused. When the tapes were finally turned over, there were missing tapes and erased segments. It seemed to all that the president had not been truthful and open as he promised during the campaign. During all of this, a dozen or so administration officials resigned, and his Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned after being accused of tax fraud and bribery. Congressman Gerald Ford took his place. The man who promised honesty in government betrayed most of his promises, and about 25 of his top aides were eventually indicted for criminal activity. His closest associates worried that he was mentally unstable. His actions also had political consequences. Congress responded to both the Vietnam War and Watergate scandal by passing several laws that would hopefully preempt future abuses of presidential power. The War Powers Act of 1973 required congressional approval of any commitment of combat troops beyond 90 days, and it also strengthened the 1966 Freedom of Information Act. The American public watched the news, seeing the situation go from bad to worse, and by 1974, people all over were calling for his resignation. The House Judiciary Committee televised its debate over impeachment. The House compiled charges against the president for obstructing justice, misusing presidential power, and failing to obey the committee's subpoenas. Nixon was not charged nor convicted of impeachment because he resigned after one of the tapes revealed he had used the CIA to keep the FBI from investigating the break-in. It was really clear he had used his position to obstruct justice and protect himself. Once the Watergate scandal broke, the nation changed culturally, and the economy changed as well. The 1970s were thus a period of transition. Americans had chose Nixon to right the country back onto a strong and stable track, but his flaws only added new cracks in the solid foundation. Not to mix any metaphors. Economically, things went sideways. For almost 30 years after World War II, Americans controlled their own economic destiny and dominated the world as a democratic superpower. But things had changed, some good and some bad. Cultural changes are difficult to describe for those who did not live through them, but during the 1970s, Americans shifted away from values of self-denial and the Protestant work ethic to the new rules of self-fulfillment, immediate gratification, and personal freedom. The civil rights movement and the feminist movement focused on the rights of individuals, which was good because more people gained access to jobs and education over time. But it also meant that Americans forgot about the virtues of community and self-control, becoming more selfish and self-centered. The greatest shift of the decade was the halt to economic growth. There had been a prolonged boom after the Second World War. Yes, there were problems in society, but the presidents in the 1960s believed that economic growth would help all Americans eventually. John F. Kennedy had said that a rising tide lifts everyone. But during the 1970s, the declining economy of the 1960s got worse as inflation rose to new heights, unemployment swelled, and productivity declined. More simply, prices went up, but wages did not. The economy entered a period of what was known as stagflation. More Americans got trapped into a vicious cycle of poverty. Women and children became the poorest Americans, and American class divisions grew wider. Times were tough, and anyone who lived through it remembers it. The political leadership of the period reflected the melees, and melees means dissatisfaction or depression, but the melees of the period. After Watergate and Vietnam, Americans became jaded about politicians. While politicians attempted to revive interest in the participation in the political issues of the day, Americans shifted back and forth between Democrats and Republicans without reason, and almost half of voters failed to go to the polls because of a feeling of alienation. They felt like their votes did not matter because politicians lied, cheated, stole, and then did whatever they wanted anyway. President Nixon had resigned in August 1974, and Nixon's second vice president, Gerald Ford, had taken his place. Spiro Agnew had been elected into the office of vice president with Nixon, but of course he had resigned in October 1973 because of the charges of money laundering and tax evasion. Apparently he accepted bribes while governor of Maryland, but it took a few years for his bad deeds to catch up with him. Ford had been chosen because he was a nice, decent guy. And if you remember the days of the 1920s, Coolidge did much of the same for the Harding administration and all of his scandals. Unlike Coolidge, however, Ford ruined his reputation within weeks of entering office. He pardoned Nixon. Nixon seemed to be the epitome of the failure of politics in America, and Ford had the chance to fix it. But he looked no better because he gave a pass to the bad guy. He then became the most conservative president since Herbert Hoover, vetoing 39 bills in 1 year. The economy came to a crashing halt during his term. Thus, for eternity, he will be remembered as the idiot president who couldn't walk 10 feet without tripping over his own feet. Here's Ford falling off of Air Force One. And then, of course, Chevy Chase made his bones on Saturday Night Live making fun of Ford. After Watergate, Americans overwhelmingly voted for the Democrats during the 1974 congressional elections, nearly 60%. Republicans lost seats, including long-held areas, to their opponents in protest of Nixon and Ford. Then, of course, Saigon fell in the next year, and things looked even better for the 1976 election. One Democrat said, "We could run an aardvark and win." Within this whole debacle, Jimmy Carter emerged as the man of the hour. He was a deeply moral man who ran in part on being a born-again Christian. Very few people had known who he was, and he had a name recognition factor of 2%. He was unknown, but Americans appreciated that he remained serious about his faith. He went around the country telling folks that they deserved a government as good, as competent, as moral, and, quote, filled with love as are the American people, end quote. Despite his obscurity, he won primaries and gained the nomination for the 1976 election. The Republicans ran Ford, who had been mocked for stumbling and falling, and who made a major mistake in one of the debates with Carter. Americans did not think either were good leaders, but voted for Carter's clean image with 51% of the votes. The primary concern of 70% of the voters was the economy, so the nation was going to watch how he dealt with the issue. Carter had a number of problems during his term in office that were out of his control, but his style of leadership also led to problems. He considered his role as president as a trusteeship, in which he was a steward for the nation's well-being. Carter disliked political negation and preferred to investigate problems in a methodical way. By gathering facts, he hoped to come to the right conclusions, which would then be so obvious that they would be accepted and implemented without argument. He would have fit well in the progressive era. During his time as president, the nation faced an energy crisis which would need a good leader. For part of 1973 and 1974, the oil-producing Arab nations placed an embargo on oil to the United States. These nations wanted to make more money and were also protesting American support for Israel. By this point, Americans were dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Big cars used a lot of gasoline, and Americans had become accustomed to getting it from overseas. Heating oil and gas prices shot up as much as 33%. Even after the boycott was over, the economy suffered because of this event. Inflation was high, and the other economic indicators demonstrated there was an economic crisis in the 1970s. Like Woodrow Wilson, Carter responded to political problems in moralistic terms, and in 1977 he delivered a speech to the nation that the country was indeed still in an energy crisis. He proposed 10 principles for new legislation and suggested new attitudes about energy, mainly pointing out that Americans needed to conserve it. They needed to find new types of energy sources and not rely on foreign oil. His plan that he put together went to Congress with 113 parts, and he expected no compromises and all of his legislation to pass through Congress together. This was not the New Deal. That was not going to happen. But he did convince Congress to create the U.S. Department of Energy in 1977. Here we can see that his leadership style failed him in achieving his goals. But things got worse politically for Carter in 1979 when Iranian revolutionaries seized and occupied the American embassy in Tehran. The Shah of Iran, America's chief ally in the Near East, had already been overthrown a year earlier. Many Iranians did not like the Shah because he seemed too Western for a leader of an Islamic nation, and when Carter allowed the Shah to come to the U.S. for medical treatment, Iranians were offended. He was replaced by the more radical Ayatollah Khomeini, and in protest of hospitality to the Shah, student radicals seized 53 Americans and held them hostage in the embassy for more than 400 days. All of this indicated to many Americans that the United States had lost control of its own fate. Because of these negative events, Carter's presidency was plagued by pessimism. Carter's positive achievements were obscured, and it was unlikely that he would ever be able to hold on to the presidency in the 1980 election. After the nation learned of Johnson's credibility gap and Nixon's sins, Americans became jaded about politics. Historians can see a big shift in how Americans perceive the value of their votes. Basically, large segments of society started to believe that politicians did whatever they wanted and had no concern for their voters. Americans also found it harder to achieve the American dream. People in my grandparents' generation bought houses, held jobs for most of their lives, and raised their families with many comforts before retiring. The children of many of these people could not buy homes or found themselves going from job to job. The American dream became more elusive. By the 1970s, the civil rights movement had made some major changes in dismantling institutional racism. But it also became clear by this point that doing all this didn't mean there was an end to racism. There was still work to be done, but no leadership to direct it. Finally, I would like to conclude with a little comment about the roller coaster of politics. With alienation and economic insecurity, Americans who did vote responded to the issues of the day. The poor economy and the lack of leadership would lead to a quick turnover. Americans who voted for Carter and the Democrats would now look to the Republicans in the 1980s. So overall, the 1970s was a time of transition, and Americans looked for strong leaders, but generally found flawed men. Ronald Reagan came into office in 1980, promising optimism and renewed faith in America as a good nation. That says as much about what the presidents before him did as what he could do. So please go ahead and listen to my lecture on Reagan, and we can see how this morphs into the 1980s. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that this information will help you in your studies. We all hope to see you at PNC when you are done with your high school degree.